The moment Jake stepped off the plane in Sydney, he thought the jet lag was messing with him. Everything looked too smooth, too organized, too calm. He expected chaos, long lines, cracked sidewalks, people rushing everywhere. Instead, what he saw was a city that felt like it had quietly figured things out without bragging about it. And that was the first red flag, because Americans don't usually travel halfway across the world just to feel underprepared for how functional another country is. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. At first, Jake brushed it off. Every country looks nice from the airport, right? Fresh paint, polite staff, a couple of fancy signs. But then he took the train. Not a luxury train, not a tourist train, just a normal public train. It arrived on time. Not close enough on time. Exactly on time, clean, quiet, no strange smells, no broken ticket machines, no announcements apologizing for delays that would somehow last 45 minutes. And suddenly, Jake realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't a special moment. This was just normal life in Australia. Back home in the US, public transport often feels like a last resort, something you tolerate if you have to. In Australia, it felt like a default option. People weren't stressed, nobody was fighting for space, nobody was yelling into their phone on speaker. And Jake caught himself thinking something he hadn't expected. Why doesn't it feel like this back home? That thought followed him everywhere. When he walked through the city, the sidewalks were wide. Bike lanes actually existed, and people used them without risking their lives. Cars stopped for pedestrians without acting like they were doing a favor. Even the crosswalk buttons worked. That sounds small, but when you've lived somewhere long enough where broken but usable is the standard, fully functioning infrastructure feels almost suspicious. Then came healthcare. This was the moment Jake had been dreading. Because Americans grow up hearing the same story. Socialized healthcare is slow, low quality, and barely works. But when Jake twisted his ankle during a coastal walk and decided to get it checked, what happened next didn't match the narrative at all. He was seen quickly, treated professionally. And when he asked about the cost, he thought he misheard the answer. It wasn't free for him as a visitor, but it also wasn't financially terrifying. No paperwork panic, no insurance maze. No "we'll bill you later" mystery charge hanging over his head. For the first time, healthcare felt like a service, not a negotiation. And that's when the realization started to settle in. Australia wasn't just different. It was quietly more developed in ways that didn't scream for attention. It didn't rely on skyscrapers or flashy slogans. It relied on systems that worked. Jake noticed it in the workplace too. Australians worked hard, but they didn't worship work. People left the office on time. Nobody bragged about burnout. Nobody treated exhaustion like a badge of honor. Conversations weren't about grinding harder or hustling nonstop. They were about weekend plans, family time, beach trips, and actually enjoying the life they were working for. Back in the US, productivity often means sacrificing yourself. In Australia, productivity seemed built around sustainability. And that difference hit hard. Then there was safety. Jake walked through neighborhoods late at night without gripping his phone like a lifeline. He didn't feel that low-level anxiety Americans learn to live with. The one where you're always scanning, always alert, always preparing for something to go wrong. Police presence felt calm, not aggressive. Security felt preventative, not reactive. It wasn't perfect, but it felt balanced. And slowly, something uncomfortable started happening. Jake stopped comparing Australia to America out of curiosity and started comparing it out of concern. Education came up in conversation with locals, and again, the pattern repeated. Less debt. More accessibility. Less pressure to treat college like a financial gamble that could define the rest of your life. People spoke about learning, not just earning, and it made Jake question something he'd never really questioned before. Why had he accepted stress as normal? Technology didn't scream future city, but it worked seamlessly. Contactless payments everywhere. Government services accessible online without frustration. Internet that didn't feel like a constant battle. Nothing flashy, just efficient. And that was the theme. Australia didn't try to impress. It just functioned. Jake realized something else too. Australians weren't constantly comparing themselves to Americans. They didn't need to. They weren't defensive. They weren't trying to prove anything. There was a quiet confidence in how the country operated, like it knew exactly what it was and didn't need validation. Meanwhile, Jake felt his American confidence cracking, not because Australia was mocking it, but because it was unintentionally exposing gaps he'd learned to ignore. He thought about how often Americans normalize stress, normalize debt, normalize broken systems, normalize being tired all the time. How often they're told, "That's just how it is." But standing in Australia, watching a society run smoothly without the constant pressure, that excuse stopped working. By the end of his trip, Jake didn't feel embarrassed to be American. He felt awakened. Because loving your country doesn't mean pretending it can't improve. And seeing another developed nation do certain things better doesn't mean losing pride, it means gaining perspective. Australia didn't feel perfect, but it felt intentional. And that difference matters. When Jake boarded his flight home, he carried more than souvenirs. He carried questions. Why does basic functionality feel like a luxury back home? Why is balance treated like weakness? Why do Americans accept systems that exhaust them instead of support them? And maybe that's why so many Americans visit Australia and come back changed. Not because Australia is louder, richer, or more powerful, but because it proves that another way of living is possible. So the real question isn't whether Australia is more developed. The real question is, why does it feel like development stopped being the priority somewhere else? And if this surprised you, wait until you hear what Americans say after living there for a full year. Let me know what you think in the comments, because this conversation is far from over. When Jake returned to Australia for a second visit, he noticed things he hadn't fully appreciated the first time. It wasn't just the big systems that worked. It was the little things. Public spaces were cleaner, yes, but they felt cared for. Parks weren't just empty patches of grass. They were places people wanted to linger. Cafes weren't just functional. They felt like community hubs. And everyone, strangers, neighbors, coworkers, moved with a kind of effortless politeness that made interactions feel human again. One evening, Jake took a walk along the coastline and overheard a conversation between two locals about local governance. In America, these discussions often feel like debates designed to fight. Here, it was practical, calm, and solution-focused. People disagreed, but they listened. And Jake realized that's another form of development, a society that prioritizes dialogue over conflict, efficiency over chaos, and collaboration over spectacle. And then there was the reaction of Americans he met living in Australia. Many admitted the same thing Jake felt, a mix of awe and frustration. Awe because systems actually worked, and frustration because they'd never seen their own country run with that kind of smooth consistency. Some joked that they'd never go back to the US. In the same way, they couldn't unsee what life could look like when basic infrastructure, healthcare, and daily life were designed to support people instead of constantly testing them. By the end of this second visit, Jake understood something essential. Development isn't just about skyscrapers or GDP. It's about everyday life functioning without constant friction. It's about systems that anticipate your needs before you even ask. It's about society trusting its citizens enough to work together rather than constantly policing them. And as he boarded his flight home again, he couldn't help but think, maybe Americans visiting Australia don't just see a more developed country. They see a mirror, a reflection of what's possible when efficiency, empathy, and intentionality guide every decision. And for Jake, that realization wasn't just eye-opening, it was life-changing.